With that, and if we've worked out our sound problems, I'd like to share a little bit about my personal background. I grew up here in Anaheim. I moved here from the Midwest in 1946 and lived over near what is now Disneyland. So you can see I haven't come very far in life. I'm only about 8 blocks from where I began my career. I was a typical pagan, coming from the pagan pool in America. There are approximately 90 million people here that do not have a church relationship of any sort. As I examined my history and background and dialogued with my family members, I discovered that no one in my family for 4 generations had had any kind of church affiliation. Although we'd been raised largely in the Bible Belt in Missouri and Kentucky, we had become a gospel-hardened people, a people that knew about the claims of Christ but had no intention of obeying and or relating to them in terms of a personal relationship. By the time I came along, we were no longer talking about it within the context of the family. And so I grew up without any personal relationship with Christ and any first-hand information concerning His claims or His person and what He had done. The first time that I met a Christian, and somebody asked me one time, they were challenging me on this point, and they said, "You mean you grew up in America and you never met a Christian?" And I said, "Well, if I did, he didn't blow his cover in my presence." The first time that I remember meeting a Christian was when a friend of mine, who will be playing drums here tonight when we have another worship service, came to see me in Las Vegas, and on the way stopped and bought a 5th of gin. That was his wife laughing. And they bought a 5th of gin because they knew I liked gin, and they bought this gin and drank it on the way to Las Vegas because it got very cold, and arrived rather inebriated, drunk for those of you in the front row. And we went out and had an evening together, and the next day they were both very, very chagrined. And we didn't understand why they were so embarrassed. Well, the truth was they were brand new Christians, and they had come on this pilgrimage of preaching Christ to us. And along the way had been inundated. I'm not sure that they've had a drink since in the last 20 years. And so instead of sharing with us the message of Christ, they shared a message of embarrassment. But a few weeks later, they made it good. We'd come back home by then, and Dick came over one day and sat down with me and told me that he'd become a Christian. And I said, "What's that? Isn't everybody in America a Christian?" And he said, "No." He said, "I'm a born-again Christian." And then we began having the dialogue of Nicodemus and Jesus. And I said, "What do you mean, born again? Do you have to enter your mother's womb?" And he said, No, it's not a physical birth, it's a spiritual birth. You have to have a second birth. You have to be born again spiritually. Well, I didn't understand what he meant, and we talked for an hour or so, and then we went off into other subjects. But over the next few weeks and months, Dick came by regularly and shared with us. My wife and I had already gone through a process in which we were hungry for God. We had purchased a Bible just a few months before that and began reading it. But before I develop that story, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We had also gone through a long and difficult time in our marriage, and we were really very ripe and harvestable people, but we were so limited in our understanding. We didn't know the first thing about Christianity. Some months before this occasion in which Dick came, I had gone to Las Vegas to work with one of the groups that I was working with at the time. At that time I had a show group, but I was also developing a rock and roll group called the Righteous Brothers. And while I was there in Las Vegas, I went through an experience. My wife and I had been separated for a few months, and I went through an experience that began, for me, marked the beginning of my spiritual trek towards Christ. What had happened was that I had, in the heartbreak of separation and all the pain and agony that goes with that, I had been seeking God in my own way. Now, it's difficult when the only people you know are musicians and druggies and alcoholics and bartenders and waitresses. And I mean, that's the only people I could have dialogue. That's who I was getting my marriage counseling from. You can imagine how good it was. And I was having dialogue with them about religion. And they were saying, oh, yeah, I'm into religion. And we talked about all kinds of diverse religions. One guy recommended that the best thing I could do is when I got off work, and by the way, I worked a late night shift, and that was a kind of a prestigious thing to do in Las Vegas. The later you worked, the more important your musical group was, because that kept people up. And I would get off at 4 in the morning, and I began driving out into the desert and watching the sun come up, because someone told me that was a good way to groove on a religious experience. And so I had done that a couple times, sat out there and watched the sun come up. And nothing happened, nothing special anyway. But this one day, I was driving out there in the morning, and as I was driving, I began reflecting on where things were in my life. Everything was a mess. My relationship with my wife was not good, and my kids, and everything was a mess, My career was zooming. I was doing well in that area, but I was an unhappy guy. And I was driving along, and I began weeping. Now, I had learned one thing in my 28 years as on the earth, and that was that a man ain't supposed to cry. You know that one? And so I'm driving along, and I begin weeping, and I'm embarrassed. I was not only embarrassed, I was humiliated. And I thought, oh no, this is weird. This is really weird. And I was crying more and more, and I began sobbing. And finally I had to pull over to the side of the road, get out of the car. I walked around for a while, cussing and kicking the cactus, and trying to get a hold of myself. And I think it grows more dramatic with the telling, but at one point, you weren't there, were you? At one point, I stopped and I looked up at the heavens, and for the first time in my life, I saw the stars and constellations as something emanating from someone. And I remember standing there, I was sort of awestruck, and I said, oh God, if you're there, help me. And I wept for a couple moments, and then all of a sudden this deep shame came over me. I thought, oh no, now you've really done it. Now you're talking to the dark. You've gone over the edge. Well, the only thing left is I'll go commit myself into the hospital. But then I remembered that part about my mother and the underwear, and so I thought, well, I better go by the hotel and change before I go to the hospital. You know that part? From that high, I've been learning that one. And so I went on. I went by the hotel, and when I walked in the hotel, besides that, I had some drugs that I thought I better put away in case I was in that hospital very long. And so I went by the hotel, and when I walked in the hotel lobby, the night clerk yelled at me and said, "Hey, John, there's a message here from your wife." And I said, "From my wife? It can't be from my wife. I mean, my wife wouldn't even talk to me anymore. I mean, it can't be from my wife." And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Call this number." So I went over to the lobby phone, and I dialed it, and sure enough, my wife answered the phone. I said, "Well, what do you want?" And she said, "Well, I've been thinking it over." And she says, "I've decided to give it one more try. Come and get me." And when she said that, it was like a blow to my chest. I fell back against the wall, and I thought, wow, I'm in touch with the supernatural. Because I realized suddenly that I had that there was a connection between that, "Oh God, if you're there, help me," and my wife responding. And I said, when did you do this? When did you decide this? She said, "About a half an hour ago." And I thought, I got her, And so I said, "Well, I'll be right there." Now, I was in Las Vegas, and we lived down by Newport Beach, Fountain Valley, actually, in those days. And I got in a car, and I drove there in 3.5 hours. Now, for those of you that are not from Southern California, you don't know how hard that is to do. But I drove fast. Anyway, I remember I got in the car, and I'm driving along, and I'm excited, and I said my second prayer. My first prayer was, "Oh God, help me," and now I said, "Atta baby God," You really got her that time, because I had been trying to get my wife to straighten up for a year, and I couldn't get her straightened out. And so I'm driving along, and I started talking to him. I figured, well, I'm on a roll. So I started talking to him about everything. How about this, and how about that, and why don't you do this, and I thought I might as well, now that I got plugged in, I might as well just talk about it all. So I get home. Now you've got to understand that this had been a really bad year. And I'd gone through a very difficult time. I was drinking very heavily, and I was using drugs, and I was working very long hours and sleeping 2 and 3 hours a day. And I was yellow from smoke. I smoked 5 packs of cigarettes a day. My nostril. And I was skinny. I weighed 150 pounds. And for me, that's skinny, super skinny. I probably was in better condition then than I am now. Anyway, and so I appear at the door, and there's my wife, and she's got the kids all bundled up, and everything's ready. And we stuff them in the car, and we're backing out of the driveway. And I turned to her and I said, "I'm in touch with the supernatural." And I can still remember she went, "Who?" Her hands sort of fluttered to her breast. And I said, "God." She said, "Oh, well, everyone knows God." And I said, "Not me. I've been talking to him." She said, "Well, that's called prayer. Don't you know about praying?" I said, "No." And suddenly she became a religious expert. And for the next hour, we talked about God. We'd never really talked about God before. We'd been married 7 years, and we'd never talked about God. And she told me all kinds of things about God. She told me about Mary, and she told me about the catechism, and she told me about she told me God had a book out. And I said, "No kidding." I said, "What's it called?" She said, "It's called the Bible." I said, "God wrote that book?" And she said, "Yes, that's God's book. He wrote that book." I said, "Well, when did he do that?" She said, "Oh, a long time ago." I said, "No kidding." I said, "Have you ever read it?" And she said, "Yeah, I've read it." I said, "All of it?" And she said, "Well, I've read lots of it." I said, "No kidding." I said, "Well, where do you get a book like that?" And she said, "Oh, you can buy them in the stores." I said, "I never saw any in the stores." Well, she said, "You've been going in the wrong stores." She said, you can get one. And so that day, I got back to Las Vegas that afternoon, and I put my family in. We rented a condominium. I put my family in there, and I decided to go down and buy a Bible.